we looked at this idea of absolutism, Baroqueness. This is San Andrea Cernal. This is the altar. And remember, they were using all this theatrical use of light, but they were also using a lot of gold. And I told you that part of the reason why the Counter-Reformation was able to do so much of this and why they were able to fund so many projects in Rome was because of everything that was coming in from the New World colonies, such as this one. So this is in Bolivia. This was one of the largest silver mines in the world at the time. And with all of this silver, although gold was kind of the metal of choice for most Europeans, silver was the metal of choice in China. And so when Spain acquires all this silver, they begin to really inflate the currency of silver, and they're able to purchase, make a lot of trade. So their empire isn't just physically around the world, especially in the Americas, but it's also through trade. So they're beginning to connect a lot more places. And of course, the person who begins this era of colonization, at least for Spain, is Christopher Columbus. And I chose this image because I thought it was really interesting, the backstory. So I'm sure most of you know he was of Italian descent or Valencian descent. It's debated, but the Spanish monarchs, Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand, decided that they wanted to expand their trading empire all the way to India, right? And they wanted this new route, and Christopher Columbus was the guy to do it. But this image is actually not from their first encounter, it's from his third journey. So Christopher Columbus goes several times to the Americas, and while he's over there on his third attempt, or his third trip, he's obviously not a great person, very, very bad to the indigenous people. In fact, he's so bad that even the people from Spain recognize that, right? So even all the Spaniards that go with him recognize that what he's doing is not just unfair, it is cruel, it is inhumane. And so they chain him up, they take him back to Spain, and then they present him to the court. But as you can see, Queen Isabella doesn't necessarily look upset with him. So the Spanish monarchs don't really care much of what's going on with the people in these new colonies. Instead, they thank Christopher Columbus, they pardon him of anything he might have done, and they send him on a fourth journey to continue doing what he's been doing all these years. And that's very much the same type of attitude that most European states had at the time when it came to their colonies and the people that were there. And this fuels, of course, the Atlantic triangle of trade. So we have all these different relationships that begin to form. So for one, Europe over here is receiving all of the raw goods coming from the Americas, whether that's gold, whether that's sugar, all of the products, tobacco, cotton, right? And they manufacture them in Europe. So in Europe, they're making the textiles, right? They're importing silk, they are producing jewelry. And in turn, the colonists want those luxurious goods, so they ship them back. And that is a back and forth between the Americas and Europe. And then we have the introduction of the African continent. We have the introduction of the African continent in part because of the Portuguese. So while the Spaniards were going from Spain, trying to go around the world to get back to India, the Portuguese had a secondary route where they were coming down around Africa and into the Indian subcontinent. But while they were doing that, of course, they discovered that there was this whole other continent that was actually much larger than they previously had thought, and they began to trade with them as well. And that trade did eventually extend to people, which is how we got the slave trade, and so forth. So we have this whole cycle going on in the Atlantic over here. And the way that they organized themselves, so Spain wanted to have control over their empire, and to do that they needed to have a model that they could work with. And so they created this thing which we call the Law of Indies, or the Laws of the Indies, which pretty much tell you how you're going to govern all these different cities and towns that you are establishing. And remember, Spain got the majority of Latin America, all the way up until California, right? So we're technically part of where Spain was. And this is the model that they chose to follow for all of these towns. So generally, it's going to be a plaza in the center. It's going to be a bit rectangular because they wanted horse events, right? For the plaza, you're going to have some kind of church, usually on the northern side. You're going to have some kind of municipal palace for your mayor, or in certain cases for the president nowadays. Hotels, all sorts of important types of institutions, banks. If you've ever been to Latin America, you know that this is pretty much how all cities operate. They have some kind of center, which is always a plaza, some kind of park, and that is where they do host events. So this is a map from 1581 of a city in Mexico. And you can see it does have its plaza in the center. It does have its church up on top. It has retail, banks, other parish churches around the blocks, right? And just to show you that this continues to be very much what most of Latin America looks like, inspired by the laws of the Indies, this is Mexico City, where we can clearly see our plaza in the center. These are just tents that they put up because they do certain events there. We have our cathedral, right? Then we have the National Palace. And then we have hotels, banks, all sorts of institutions around that center. If you go further south into Guatemala City, you get the same thing, right? You get your plaza. In this case, your church is going to be up here, and then you're going to have all your institutions around it. If you keep going further south, you go to Costa Rica, same thing applies. You still have your plaza, you still have your church, and you have your other buildings. If we go back to that mining town I showed you in Bolivia, it's actually super well preserved. Anytime that you still see those orangish or pinkish roofs, that means that there is some level of historic preservation going on. So if we go back to Mexico City, they're actually doing a really good job with preserving a lot of the historical architecture because it's still primarily very pink because of the Spanish tiles. Over here, where you see the grayish, that means they're using more modern flat concrete roofs. So Guatemala City's kind of there. You can see in Costa Rica, it's very much a mixture. But in this specific city, which is very historic because it's where all silver was coming from, a lot of it, the original core has been preserved, right? There is your church over there, National Palace, right? And then we have our plaza. And I want you to notice that geographically, all of these are very different. So in this next one, we even have a river over here on the right. This is in the Dominican Republic. Same thing applies. And notice that they're just kind of imposing this grid over the geography, whether there's a river there, whether there's some kind of ravine or cliffside going on, or whether it's flatlands. They are using the law of Indies to regulate every single town that they are settling, so that as people travel and as indigenous people begin to familiarize themselves with the Spaniards, they have this level of control, right? They can easily recognize that this is a Spanish city, and this is probably where the church is going to be. This is probably where the president, the governor, or your mayor is going to be. And we also begin to develop this system of castes. So we have the mixture of all these different races. So we have Spaniard Europeans, indigenous people, and then we have people from the African continent. And they make all these types of combinations, and they create a caste system. So the closer to white you are, the higher up you are, is basically how it works. If you are directly from Spain, you're going to be at the top of it. If you're white, but you were born in the Americas, you're a level below that. If you are mixed, and then finally, if you are indigenous or you're African, you're going to be at the bottom caste. And this caste system is going to inform architecturally what's going to be going on with our churches. So we're going to have two types of churches.
Peninsulares, criollos, mestizos, and indios, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we also have mulattoes, and we have, yeah. So for our colonial Spanish churches, we have two types. So we have our regular churches, which are meant for the peninsulares, the criollos, the people that come from Spain, and the people that have newly been converted, that might have indigenous or African blood. And then we have our mission churches, and these are primarily meant for people of indigenous descent, and they are meant to convert them. And they're going to look very different, but you're going to see that at the end of the day, they're still pretty much churches, preaching boxes. It's just the level of ornamentation, the way that they're designed is going to be slightly different. So just to give you an image, one of our regular churches in the towns, the ones that are on the plaza, are going to look like that. And then one of our mission churches will look like this, right? So at its core, it's still the same thing, right? You can still kind of see the church shape, but you can see that the level of detail, the amount of effort that's going into them is quite different. With our regular churches, generally you would have people come all the way from Spain. You would have their architects come in, especially if it's an important city, and they would be the ones that would be redesigning or designing these facades. So they were trying to emulate what's going on in their motherland. With our mission churches, you typically just had people that were indigenous make them, and then you would convert them inside of there. And because of that, they're going to be very much vernacular construction methods, right? So they're not going to be teaching indigenous people how to do all of that Baroque, stone sculpting. They're not going to waste time on that. They're going to use their traditional methods, which usually are going to be by using earthy materials. And then they're going to be focusing on the conversion after the fact. And once they're converted, then they can move into the city and they can go to the regular churches. So this one is in Tlaxcala, Mexico. It's kind of close to Mexico City. And this is what the Spaniards interpreted their version of the Baroque as, right? So I told you we still have remnants of the older medieval Renaissance styles, and this is an example of that. These are what we call estipites. So notice how there isn't really a column here. It's just these kind of pieces that vaguely resemble the shafts, the capitals of columns, but even then they're not really correct capitals, and they're just these kind of composed pieces that from far away might look like a column, but close up, now that you guys understand the principles of classical detail, you can see that they're not really emulating any sort of existing column. They're just making this stuff up as they go. The Spanish had their version of the Baroque, which they called chirrageria, and it's characterized by having all their surfaces covered by all sorts of carving, high relief, low relief, everywhere. So there really is no sense of breathing room on these facades, right? So we take a closer look. Every single part of it is carved. So if you thought the Italians were doing a lot, the Spaniards do take that a step further. And remember, this is the New World, right? But this is all covered in gold. It's using the language of Europe. They're still having their traditional altar. They're crossing. It is a line across church. So it doesn't look much different. That's why we're considering this, right, the regular church that people who are familiar with the religion already and are Christians would be going to. Here's another example of how the Spaniards do the Baroque. And this one, again, is in the New World, meaning it's nowhere as elaborate as the ones that are being done in Spain. So imagine this times like 10 for what Spain has going on. The whole interior of their church looks like this, not just the altar area. Now, the mission church is going to look a little bit different. It's going to be, in many ways, a combination of Native American traditional religious practices with Christian traditional architecture. So because Native Americans or the indigenous people of these areas usually practice religion outdoors, the missionaries understood that in order to convince them to go over to the Christian religion, they were going to have some kind of outdoor elements. So they had what we call an atrio, an atrium, an outdoor space in the front, and then they had these fosas all the way around. And in each of these, you would basically have like little chapels, right? Little outdoor chapels. You have your main church, and then you usually have a convent, which is where your people that work the church would usually live in. And this is what a typical missionary church looks like. This one is actually in New Mexico, right? So it does extend pretty far north. And you can see it does have its outdoor area. The church itself is right there, and then in the back is going to be its convent. And on the inside, they're going to try to emulate the idea of those churches, the regular ones that are in the city, but they're going to do it again with more humble vernacular vocabulary, something that indigenous people are more accustomed to, so that it doesn't feel so alien to them, and they feel more inclined to convert over to the Christian faith. So you can see they're using exposed wood beams, and then their altar, we call this arrerdo, is made of wood. So the idea of the estipites is still there, right? These are not real column orders, but they're now all made of wood, and they use paint instead, which is a lot cheaper, it's more accessible. You don't have to bring people all the way from Spain to do this. You can have people that have indigenous building techniques make these for you quite easily. Another thing that happens is we also have the combination of the two cultures. So if you are Latin American, you probably recognize these images. So a lot of stories like this begin to be used in order to convert people of indigenous backgrounds. So in this case, this is the Virgin of Guadalupe. She's primarily seen in Mexico. And the story behind it is that you have an indigenous man named Diego Rivera who sees her on a hill, and then he tries to tell the archbishop. It's like a long story, but the archbishop doesn't believe him until he shows up with this mantle where she appears and these roses come out. And it was a story that was used to show the people of the Americas, the indigenous people, that they too could become Christian, that they could have these miracles happen to them, right? And it helped largely in the conversion of the people of this new continent. And everywhere you go, right, every city, every town, if you're Latin American, you know what I'm talking about, they're all gonna have their own version of this. They're all gonna have a different version of the Virgin Mary with a different name and typically a different story that might not be so different from this one. Now in England, we're gonna have a very different type of thing going on. So in England, they don't typically mix with people of indigenous descent. They like to keep themselves pretty divided, and instead the division that we're gonna see is geographically between our rebels in the north and then our English people that come from England in the south. So the northern churches are gonna be our pilgrims. So if you remember history class, pilgrims escaped from England because they were being persecuted, and they decided to go to this new continent where they could start fresh, and there was no king that could be imprisoning them for heresy or for all these uprisings. So they are up in the north in Massachusetts, and we have not just the pilgrims, we have Quakers, we have Puritans, we have Shakers, we have all sorts of radical religious groups that are from the Protestant branch that go up to the north to establish themselves. And what they have, in very much the fashion of Protestant churches, are typical preaching boxes. In the southern colonies, those are going to be the ones that England actually orders to be established, right? So the northern ones are rebels, the southern ones are ordered by the actual state of England. So these are going to be Virginia, named after Elizabeth, the Virgin Queen, Georgia, named after the King Georges, Charleston, Carolina, named after King Charles, etc. And these are going to be based on companies. So these are going to be the tobacco, the sugar companies, the cotton companies that are going to be owned by the actual Crown of England. And because of that, we're going to have very different styles, because one of them is here for pure religious reasons, and the other one is here for economic reasons. So they're not really focused on religion. So they're just going to kind of copy-paste a regular church, just to have it, just to go, but it's not really their main priority. And so our northern churches are going to look like, again, the Protestant preaching boxes, very simple. And our southern churches are going to try to vaguely look like the English churches. Now again, they're not putting that much effort into these. They're there for economic purposes, to make money, to ship things back to England. They have it because they need to, because every English settlement must have some kind of parish church. And you can see they're trying to kind of emulate Gothic architecture with brick, but they're not really putting that much effort into it, right? It's still a very plain type of church. So that church is the old ship meeting house. It has been painted several times, but you can see it's very boxy. We also have what we call shiplapping going on, and because this is a very cold area, it's colder than England, they use this method where they have the boards overlap over each other to keep out the wind. So the original buildings were just regular like cabins with wood like this, but they soon realized that it was much colder than they were used to, and they began to overlap the wood like this. So that way they keep out the elements and they keep out the wind. It has a steeple, and then on the inside I want you to notice that these are not benches. These are instead these little boxes. And that is because each box was meant for a family. So remember, these are radical Protestants. And for them, the family unit was the most important thing, which is why you would go with your family to church and you would each sit in one of these boxes instead of the traditional benches that you would see in other Christian churches. The inside is, of course, very plain, but notice the pulpit is still here, the sounding board is still here. And then in the south, we have this one. St. Luke's Church, right? You can see that they're trying to emulate the wall buttresses here and there, or little lancet windows, but it's nothing that fancy, nothing that large. On the inside, it's still very plain. You know, they're still using the normal benches that you would use in Anglican faith. They don't really try to do anything very different for it. Now, the homes are going to be very similar as far as how innovative they are, which they're not. So the goal of most colonial homes is just to emulate what's going on in England. So for a really long time, even after the United States does become independent, they are trying to copy whatever Europe is doing, because Europe is going to be the heart of all these ideas, right? The innovative architecture, the architects, the training, all of that is on the European continent. And so because these people are trying to make themselves seem like they are equal to their counterparts on the English lands, they're going to try to copy over that architecture. However, one, they don't have the money to do it, they don't have the architects to do it, and so their recreations are actually very poor. And we're going to see they're going to look a little funny compared to what we now know is correct classical or English Baroque architecture. So the solution for them is to use pattern books. And the pattern book that they're going to use in these American colonies is going to be James Gibbs's book of architecture. So I did include this if you want to look at it after the fact. But we're going to take a look at the book just so you get an idea of what kinds of patterns and things they could find in here. It was really a large range, but they had everything from floor plans and facades, which I believe were at the beginning. So you can see that this is a church. And Gibbs gives you options, right? So he tells you can make it like that, or you can have these little staircases and have it like this. He's giving you all these types of modules to choose from. So he's giving you this piece of the facade. Notice that all of them are different. So if you wanted to make them all triangular pediments, you could do that. And then it's really towards this area over here where he gives you lots of options. So notice he's giving you all of these headings for doors, but they're all in some way or form different from each other. The decoration, notice also that the classical detail is wrong, right? So there isn't really any column, you just have corbelling. It's very mannerist almost. So Gibbs's priority is not to create correct Renaissance classical architecture. Instead, he's just trying to create as many variety or options as he can, right? And that goes on and on and on. So this is a gate, and he does have them if you want a small gate. And notice that the sides are different. So he's giving you 6 options on one page. And the colonists love this book because they don't actually have to think about design. They can just copy whatever is going on in here, flip through it, and choose their favorite pieces, and then just kind of put it all together. These are some triumphal columns and obelisks. So there's a ton of options in here. So I'm going to show you a typical James Gibbs project where he uses these patterns in his own architecture and he includes them in there. So for many colonists, James Gibbs is kind of like this huge figure that they're all copying without even really knowing much about him. This is one of his churches. I want us to look at it. He's trying to use classical architecture. You can see it's a parish church, it's a box, right? But then he's taking this temple front and just kind of putting it on the front. And we can see that this kind of square column and this circle column right here clash into each other. So Gibbs isn't necessarily known for having a very neat type of architecture. In fact, he's known for just kind of putting things together. And his steeple, you can see, is a whole different language from this classical Greek pediment. And then the inside doesn't even look like that at all, right? It looks like more of a Baroque church. So he's mixing and matching lots of things. And in the same way that he's doing it, obviously the colonists are going to want to do that too. So I'm going to show you one of the homes from the colonies. This is the Vassal House. And I'm going to show you really quickly from Gibbs's book the page that I think inspired this. So this is from his book. He gives you the floor plan, right? So you don't even have to think about how to arrange these spaces. And then he gives you a little elevation up there. And there are several options. options, but I thought this one was the one that mostly resembled the vassal house, right? So it has its Greek pediment on top, it has this hip roof, it has a central pavilion, it has the stairs, right? So it's very similar, but notice that because they cannot afford stone, and they probably don't have as many people that are familiar with stone building techniques, they use the same lathing technique with their wood. These are pilasters, these aren't true columns. And then notice that the pilaster isn't all the way at the end of it, right? So structurally, your columns would be on those corners. It makes sense to be on those corners. But because the colonists don't really know any better, they just kind of put it where they think it should go, right? And again, they're using pattern books, so they don't really understand the theory that the Renaissance thinkers were using when they were implementing classical detail. So notice also the tops of those windows run into the cornice, right? There's just a lot of stuff going on over here. Over here, they do have the Ionic capital, which should touch the entablature up here, but instead they add this little extra piece, and so forth.
So did they lack proportion, or did they still have an idea of proportion when they did that?
So these weren't trained architects that were making it, so they weren't necessarily thinking about things like proportion. They were thinking about how do we get a decent looking house in the fastest, amount of time possible. And again, because Gibbs's book gives us the floor plan as well, they don't have to think about proportion. They can just kind of copy this. And if they want to make the room slightly bigger, that's not really a problem for them because they're not trained to think like architects who are thinking about all these things.
Gotcha.
Right. And then fun fact, so this up here is what we call a widow's perch. So the idea of the widow's perch up there is at the time, if you had a husband who was in overseas trading, you would basically wait up there until he came back from his journey, but obviously the ocean is very dangerous, so many times they didn't come back. And so many women became widowed waiting for their husbands up there. Just a fun fact. All right, so we're quickly gonna head over back to the continent to kind of gear up towards what's gonna be the Enlightenment of Europe. So back on the continent, architecture is advancing super slowly, okay? We've had all this Renaissance talk since the 1400s. It is now the 1700s, and they're kind of continuing to do the same thing for around like 250 to 300 years. They just kind of continue to break these rules, but even that's getting kind of boring to them. So the following building is one of the last examples of this kind of Baroque Renaissance era in England. And after it, we're going to have this big break with the Enlightenment. So this is what we call Blenheim Palace. It is enormous. Okay, so this is the palace itself over here. These are all of the grounds. Blenheim Palace was created as a gift to a duke who helped win a war against France. And to this day, not even the King of England has something this large, right? So it tells you how important that war must have been for the English. Now, what archetype are we looking at here? What does this look like? We looked at it last week. Yeah, it looks like a French palace, particularly or specifically it looks like Versailles. So it's kind of ironic that this duke defeated the French, and then as a gift they give him something inspired by the French palace itself. But we can see one of the examples of how the Louvre is becoming the prototype for palaces, again, not just in France, but in all of Europe. It has a big forecourt, just like Versailles, with its steps. And then it has its primary suites, and then these wings over here are going to be for the servants on the outside. Notice that it still has a rusticated base over here, right? It has its colossal colonnade, 2-story pilasters, central pavilions, and then a kind of idea of end pavilions. But then if you look really closely, it's very much more ornate than the Louvre itself, right? The Louvre, remember, was created as sort of an antithesis to all of the Baroqueness that's going on in Rome, which is why they fired Bernini, and then they hired a French architect to give them something more sober and elegant. And the French, or the English, take that idea, right, the 4 basic parts, but they add a lot of Baroqueness to it. So notice all of these little windows they're putting in, double column right here. servants. And then they add these little tassel things to the roof, which have never really been done before. They are quite unique, right? In the back, we have these exedras coming out. We have caryatid pilaster women, double pilasters. So it's very Mannerist, very Baroque. In plan, it looks kind of like Versailles, right, with side wings on rooms.
I've seen that somewhere. What is this?
And then its interiors look very much like a French palace, right? So they're very ostentatious, they're grand. Notice all of this, they have mini columns, big columns, entablatures running into the columns, this huge archway on top. So it's a lot for the English themselves. Notice they're using all of these different stones, patterns, they're using shells up on here, they're using trompe-l'oeils. And that spurs a desire for simplicity. So the English, at least the refined Englishmen, feel that this is too much. They want to reject it. They don't like this mix and match approach. They want something that is clean, something that is rational, if you will. And they feel that this is too Catholic for the northern countries. And it kind of is a little Catholic, right? It looks a lot like all of those churches that we were looking at just last week, the Counter-Reformation churches. So they want to do something that they feel embodies the spirit of England a little bit more. So the Enlightenment happens to offer that to them. So I'm going to explain the general ideas of the Enlightenment first. And pay attention to these because I'll probably ask you on the exam something about the Enlightenment and all its ideas. So in a nutshell, the Enlightenment, by definition, is a new way of seeing technology, arts, law, politics, and general organization in a way that has a more humanitarian emphasis. By humanitarian, we do not mean humanism, and I want us to make that difference. So the Renaissance thinkers were about humanism, which was about viewing someone as an individual. So that means you are not just part of this group of Christian people, but you are in fact a person who has your own inner thoughts, your own personality, outside of the general group. Humanitarian emphasis means that we're thinking about the feelings of those individuals, the thoughts of those individuals, and we're beginning to care about those things. And so people begin asking these questions. So the first one is, we have increased conversations on what it means to be a human, including, for example, if lower classes are also humans, why do we treat them so badly, right? Should they be treated better if they are humans just like the upper class people? And this is something that becomes huge, especially in the colonies where they did have slavery. People begin to become enlightened, but then they begin thinking, well, if we're all human, why would we be enslaving other people, right? Shouldn't we all have the same basic rights? The second thing that happens, we have increased conversations on the idea of rationality. And this directly clashes with both religion and the king and the monarchy. So people begin wondering, is religion rational? Is what the Bible is saying something that could happen? And then in turn, they begin wondering, well, if there is this divine right of kings that says that God chooses who's the king, well, if God isn't real, then this divine right of kings isn't real, then why should we listen to this king who isn't really doing anything for us, the people of the lower class? So people begin asking this question. And lastly, there is an increased interest in systematic methods. So how can we standardize things to reduce the amount of errors in our systems? And this isn't just our judicial systems, it is our scientific systems, it is all types of systems that we're trying to kind of standardize. And so that leads to several reforms. Number one, reforms in political and judicial systems. So now we are allowing more people to vote because people are beginning to realize, well, I'm a human, I'm rational, I should have the right to vote, and if I don't get the right to vote, I'm going to revolt. Which leads to our second thing, revolutions for freedom, of which the United States is the most famous one. So the colonists kind of read all of these Enlightenment ideas and they agree with them. They say, yeah, why can't we be sovereign? Why should we be treated as less than by the English when we are equally human? So they revolt and they gain their freedom. We also have this idea of more schools, more scholarships, the idea that even if you're born without money, you should have the ability to go educate yourself and become a rational being. So more books, more literacy. We also have this idea of inalienable rights. And that's, of course, what's going to be basis for countries like the US, new democracies, life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. All of those things are very familiar to us because our country is very much founded by Enlightenment ideas. And then we have an increase in secularization where the church loses a lot of power and hold, and we begin to have these institutions, these departments that are overseeing things like education, which previously was under the church, but is now beginning to be separated. And because it's now secular, you can begin to expand the amount of things that are being taught, including science. And lastly, and what's really going to matter for architecture, is this emphasis on the scientific method. So, scientific method, obviously you observe, you make a hypothesis, you do your experiment, and it's usually a very controlled experiment where the only variables are the ones that you're going to be observing, right? And for architecture, they want to create a very similar method. And that ends up manifesting as these four things. So first, people want accurate historic revivals, and they want a way to go out into these ruins, analyze them, and have this method for analyzing them, and then bringing back these new accounts that they're having and implementing them, right? So they want more rational historic revivals. So rather than just saying, well, I think the Romans used columns, so I'm going to use columns, they're going to go out, they're going to look at what the Romans actually did, document it, get the correct proportions, and then apply that to their own buildings. The second thing they're going to do is they're going to rationalize structures. So what does architecture mean at its core? And I'll show you a text for that in a second. The third thing is the acceptance of new materials. So for a very long time, stone was really the only thing that they built with, or wood. But now we're beginning to have the Industrial Revolution, and they're beginning to wonder, well, what if we use these new industrial materials? It's rational to use them, it's cost efficient to use them, so maybe we should accept them. And then the last thing is new building types. Because people are now enlightened, they're reading, so we need things like libraries. People are now having bank accounts, so we need more banks. We need theaters to spread all of this culture to the people, and so forth. So we're going to be exploring these last two in the next couple of weeks with the Industrial Revolution. We're primarily going to be looking at these top two for today. We're going to start with one of the first books. So this leads to that idea of having more accurate historic revivals. And this is a book written by two Englishmen called Stuart and Revitt, called The Antiquities of Athens. Antiquities of Athens was basically these two Englishmen. They are trained, they are scholars, they are gentlemen, right? And they're traveling down to Greece, which is the first time that we do this, because at the time it was so dangerous to be traveling that far. But every good English gentleman does need to travel to the European continent at some point to complete his education. And Stuart and Revitt decide that they're going to go further than any other English gentleman has gone, and they go all the way to Greece, which, remember, is under Ottoman rule at this time. So when they arrive in Greece, the Ottomans think that they are English spies, and they try to kick them out, but eventually they just kind of mingle around, and they eventually document a lot of things that they put into this book. So they have this methodical exploration of classical architecture, which is where we have that emphasis on the scientific method. So for every single piece that they encounter, they show us, number one, how does that piece of architecture look today in its ruined state? Number two, how might it have looked when it was originally conceived? And number three, they documented all of the details. And notice that they didn't just document them in drawings, they also gave us proportions, formulas, and ways to correctly get all of these. Everything down to how many pieces the fluting should have, how wide those should be, etc., etc. This is also the first time that they differentiate between Roman and Greek architecture. So because they're going down to Greece and then later they do go out to Italy, they are able to correctly identify what we now know as Roman and Greek architecture. So for you guys, you had a whole 2 weeks to focus on the differences between them. And you saw, again, Romans focus more inside out, Greeks are more outside in. Greeks have an emphasis on landscape. And now people all over Europe are beginning to learn this. So I'm going to show you a book, really, or part of the book really quickly. And again, all of these are available on the UNLV library. Or sorry, it's not this one, it's this one. So this is part of Antiquities of Athens. So we're just going to scroll through to a random page. So here is one example, right? So they have this small temple, and they are documenting it as they have found it. You can see that it's very ruined at this point. It has some infill since then. And then they're even documenting what kind of people live in this area now. So then, the next step in their scientific process is documenting it as it once was. So they take the correct floor plan, they take all of the dimensions, they do the full, orthogonal drawings, elevations, they do the section of it. And then they begin to dive into the smaller details. And this book becomes huge, right? It becomes super popular in Europe, and it inspires what we call academically correct neoclassicism, right? So neoclassicism with a lowercase n just means new classical architecture, which is what the Renaissance was doing. But when we're talking about capital N neoclassicism, we're referring to this, to academically correct neoclassicism, which actually does look at the correct proportions, the correct drawings, and truly emulates it according to what it should have been. So at this point, they stopped doing all that Mannerist and Baroque stuff where they're taking liberties and redesigning and being creative. They stopped doing that, and instead they focus on this more scientific approach to historic revivalism. Right, and this is another one of their plates. Another text, this one is going to focus more on the idea of what is architecture, what is it at its essence. This is Logier's essay on architecture. He is a French rationalist, okay? And because he's French, he likes simplicity a lot. So he's going to try to attempt to break down architecture into three elements, and he calls this a primitive hut. So his idea is that before architects or architecture was a thing, people had to seek shelter out in nature, and nature naturally provides us with a column, an entablature, and a roof, if you really look hard enough, right? And then that manifests itself as vertical, horizontal, and the plane. So he believes every building is made of these three things, which obviously it is, but he wants us to now emphasize that, right? So rather than emphasizing all of these things, right, capitals, decoration, all these external things, he wants more of an emphasis on that core structure. So I think Logier would really like modern architecture. So he advocates for this return to simpler times, and then he initiates structural neoclassicism, where you have more of an emphasis on the structure of the building. This is the cover of it, so we're going to analyze it really quickly. Who do you guys think this woman is? What is she embodying? Remember, this is a book that was written for architects, right? So think about what she is doing in relationship to our little cherub over here. Who do you think the cherub is, and who do you think the woman is?
It's like she's like a queen, or she's somebody of importance, and she's like telling him what to do. Seems like.
Yes, she's leading him. She's telling him what to do. And this book is, again, for architects. So she's telling the cherub, who is supposed to be the embodiment of the genius, or the genius of the architect, and she's pointing to him, go do that, don't do this. She is the embodiment of architecture. So she is the idea that architecture is telling the genius of the architect to go do a primitive hut with its three basic elements, and forget about all this rubbish that is all this external decoration that the Mannerists and Baroque architects were doing. So we're going to look at Chiswick House. So this was after all these ideas begin to be implemented. Chiswick House is kind of interesting. It's an outlier. It's inspired by this house. This is the Villa Rotunda. Villa Rotunda is made by a Renaissance architect called Palladio. And for some reason, the English people of this group, so they have kind of like frats, if you will, so like old school frats. So this frat in particular believes that all Renaissance architects are fake and they're not doing classical architecture correct, except Palladio. For some reason, they love Palladio. And Palladio has his Villa Rotunda, which you see here. It has 4 framed views, very, very Renaissance in its floor plan. And they're going to attempt to copy him because they believe that Palladio is correct historic architecture, right? Obviously, he's not. We don't really find this sort of thing out in Greek or Roman architecture. It's not really the archetype that they would have used, but they right? So we're more so focusing here on what they believed that they were doing rather than what they actually did. This is Chiswick House. So it has a rotunda, which in this case is an octagon dome. They try to do the four framed views that we have in the Villa Rotunda, but because England is a lot colder than Italy, they just kind of end up having windows. So they have a front portico, right? We have a rusticated base, but notice that this is a very clean temple front pediment, right? So they are correctly using Stuart and Revitt's book here. This is exactly what they put inside of their book. They're just kind of pasting it onto here. And notice that they're not necessarily trying to revive the full temple as it was. They're simply if they're going to revive a temple front, the idea is we're going to do it the correct way, even if it's not applied to a building that existed back in the day. So that's the idea of capital neoclassicism. We're going to take modern forms and we're going to apply detail in its correct form, kind of like as a combo. On the back, this is what it looks like. So it's not nearly as grand as the original Villa Rotunda. So again, this isn't really a trained architect. This was, again, kind of a frat of gentlemen at the time, and they believed that they were being these enlightened thinkers and architects. But clearly we can see how clumsy all of this is. Notice that these keystones don't form a full archway here. They just kind of bump into this entablature. These little windows are not really that grand. They do try to copy Palladio's window, so this is what we call a Palladian window. But for the most part, it's not really going to be an impressive piece of architecture. It is quite famous in film, so if you like historical dramas, they always include Chiswick House because it's really close to London for film purposes. But the interior elevations, what does this look like? A square with an attic and then a dome. We looked at this during our Renaissance week. An interior elevation.
Michelangelo's church, right?
Yes, Michelangelo's new sacristy.
Yeah.
Yes, so they are directly trying to kind of revive that idea, but notice that it's not like Michelangelo's in the sense that it doesn't have all of this weird mannerist detail breaking the rules. So they are trying to use these a little bit more correctly according to Stuart and Revitt's books. So it's what the new sacristy should have looked like if it was using the correct use of historic revival. For us, it might not seem that different. It's honestly really hard to tell which is correct and which one isn't. And in many ways, they did continue to do things incorrectly, but the difference is that they believed that they were doing it the right way. So it's the shift in thought that we're really focusing on for this house. We can see their pediments are broken, right? That's not correct use right there. But the inside, notice it's a lot less Baroque. So they're not using all this marbling and veining. It still has some gold, but it's a little bit more simple, right? Looks a little bit nicer. And they consider this more enlightened than what Blenheim Palace was doing. But for our eyes, it's still kind of the same thing, right? Then we have Austerley Park, where I think this goes a step further. So Austerley Park was an existing structure, but then we have Robert Adams come in, and he adds this portico. And notice that it is very correctly proportioned. He's using Ionic columns. The frieze up here has, it looks like an emblem of some sort, which, remember, Greek friezes typically had a story about what the temple was for. So in this case, it's probably telling us what Austerley Park is or who it's for. This is another very famous filming location. On the inside, you can see that it gets even more simple. So at this point, they've removed the idea of gilding and gold. The columns, the pilasters are still kind of wonky at the top, right? But we're inclining a little bit more into correct structural expression. So notice that our pilaster is right at the corner. This is not, again, what that vassal house in the colonies was doing, where they offset the columns in. They're putting it right where it should be. They are clearly marking bays that are all equal, right? So this is very similar to what Brunelleschi was doing in his old sacristy, where he was marking where each bay would be, if this was made with columns and entablatures. Robert Adam is known for this type of interior, where he has a foreground and a background. So he's differentiating the wall from the decoration, which is very different from the Baroqueness that we saw in Blenheim Palace, where you almost can't tell where the wall Michelangelo carved his pieces inside out, so it was very difficult to tell where is the actual wall. This is a very Enlightenment way of designing, where the wall is clearly expressed, the structure is clearly there, and these are just very lightly applied frills here and there. But notice that the ceiling is clearly marked as the ceiling, and the walls are the walls. We have a very interesting hint in this room, which we call the Etruscan room, of more historic revivalism. So if you remember when we talked about Rome, the Romans do come from the Etruscan civilization. And one of the rooms in here, Adams does create to resemble that. So we do see that revivalism comes in many ways and forms, and the fact that he's straight up kind of extracting the Etruscan out of the Roman shows us that we have had people go out there and differentiate all these styles. So previously we would have just attributed this style to the kind of general Greeks, Romans, Etruscans all mixed together. But by Adam's time, we now know that they are a whole different civilization. And finally, we're going to head back to the colonies. So now I want you to kind of take all those ideas of the Enlightenment, of rational thinking, secularization, new forms of controlling the government, inalienable rights, and that's everything that Thomas Jefferson is going to put into the University of Virginia. So we're going to see lots of Enlightenment ideas here. So Thomas Jefferson wants a new place of learning, which already is very much an Enlightenment idea, right? A university is meant to be a place of learning, and being that these are, or rather this is a new country at this point, so they've become independent, they want to educate this whole new generation of people that are going to grow up to become the first generation of US citizens, right? So what does he do? He creates this set of pavilions around a rotunda over here. In traditional universities in England, you would have a church in the center, because remember, the church was kind of at the top of everything. If you had a university, it was probably because it was built by the church, or it was going to be sponsored by the monarch, who is an extension of the church as well. So they were going to have a chapel in the center, but Thomas Jefferson, in a very Enlightenment manner, decides that we're not going to have a church or a chapel at the center of this. Instead, we're going to have something that's more symbolic of learning. And so he creates this rotunda, which is now the library of the University of Virginia, to be kind of the focal point of this whole learning pavilion, or academic village, as he calls it. So by doing this, he's creating more of an emphasis on the books, on rationality, on all this expression of ideas, and what archetype or what building in particular does this resemble? This one should be super easy. Yes, this resembles our Pantheon. So remember, our Pantheon in Rome had that same saucer dome, it had that same temple front, but the idea of the Pantheon was we're going to put all of these gods from all these different cities and regions around the Roman Empire inside of here, and we're symbolizing that although they have all these different gods and goddesses, we are all part of the same empire, and that Rome is at the center of that empire. And in the same way, they're using this, specifically the Pantheon, to symbolize that there's many different ideas in this new country, right? It's a university, you have different subjects, you have people of different backgrounds, but at the end of the day, they are all here for one purpose, and that purpose is to learn. The interior floor plan is a little bit funny. It doesn't technically function that well as a library, because you can imagine it's very difficult to organize stacks here, right? Thomas Jefferson himself was not a trained architect, and we can very clearly see that in a lot of his designs. So he does have to hire this guy named Benjamin Latrobe, who is a architect. And Benjamin Latrobe pretty much just kind of comes after Thomas Jefferson with the cleaning rag and just polishes everything that he does. Because Thomas Jefferson might have all the ideas, right, and the correct intentions, but he doesn't have that training of proportion, of classical details, of how it should actually be done. So he doesn't really understand design like that. But Latrobe comes in and helps him refine those ideas. So here we have our little Pantheon of learning. And around the Pantheon, we are going to have all these little academic villages, right? So each of these is where our staff and our students are going to live. So back when this was the full extent of the library, everyone lived in one of these little cabins, so to speak. I think I had a link I wanted to show you guys. Here we go. So I want you to notice that all of these are a little bit different, right? So although in plan it's very symmetrical, the elevations of them are not symmetrical or very similar at all. So if we place ourselves inside of here, right, and we zoom into each of these, this one is using a Doric column, right? This one is using a Corinthian column.
I'm gonna use a brush.
Over here, we don't really have a temple pediment over it. It's instead of hip roof. If we look around, we have different types of roofs, right? This one doesn't really have a temple front at all. These over here have thermal windows, but they have different decoration. So every single one of them is very unique and has a very different take on the correct historic revival that Stewart and Revitt have in their book. And the idea behind that is that he wants the people that are studying here, all of these scholars, to have a kind of direct manifestation or physical manifestation of that book. So he's telling them all of these are technically correct ways to build. They're hodgepodged onto this campus so that you can look at them. So you don't just have the same copy-paste temple fronts everywhere, but you have options and you can better understand how classical architecture should work. He also uses serpentine walls, so these are just kind of snake walls, right, that are made of brick, and they are made with a singular line or row of bricks, right? And notice that they are quite tall. Why do you guys think that he made them in that serpentine pattern? Think about the difference between this wall, and then if we had a wall with the same height, but it was straight, with a singular line of bricks. What is the difference between the two walls?
The support.
Yeah, the support. So if you have a singular line of bricks, bricks are not that thick, right? And if it's that tall, it really wouldn't take a whole lot for it to be knocked over. Reinforced walls with rebar are not really a thing at this time, so it would just fall over. But by using a serpentine wall, it can't really fall any which way because it has support on both sides. And so Thomas Jefferson is also very intelligent about the economics of building this. So he decides we are going to have a wall. I don't want to use that much brick. I don't want to use stone because it's even more expensive. So we're going to use a singular row of bricks. And in order to keep it from falling over, we're going to have this very peculiar shape, which today has become very iconic, and it is an instant kind of recognition of the campus for University of Virginia. So that's kind of bringing us back to the colonies, and that's where we're going to end today's lecture. So you can see we've kind of come full circle. We came from copying these kind of weird English pattern books that are incorrect. We have this whole Enlightenment phase, and then when we come back, they are now basing themselves on these new books. They're not basing themselves on patterns, but they are basing themselves on theories. And that is something that will continue into next week and the week after that. We're going to get into the Industrial